Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Okay, good morning. I'm Colonel Barry Baer, U.S. Army retired, graduate of the University of Colorado, undergrad and graduate. I've served in the United States Army for 26 years, commanding troops in combat in Vietnam, and brigade commander in the first Gulf War. Since then, I've been a practicing chief financial officer for all over the United States. But I love University of Colorado and looking forward to hearing from our panelists. I will be the moderator for this panel. And for recording purposes, today is April 11th, 2024. It is 10:30 a.m. and this is panel number 18,000, period. And we are titled, which is very interesting, so I'm definitely looking forward to hearing comments. How do other countries view U.S. foreign policy considering our upcoming presidential election? But before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous people, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectable. For those who don't know, for this year, for 2023-2024, we had 52 new Native American students enroll in the University of Colorado. In addition, the University of Colorado here in Boulder also established a position of Associate Vice Chancellor to sponsor Indigenous students, and the individual who is performing in that role is the head of one of these indigenous tribes. So we are actually at CU putting action to where we're saying that we honor this, and you should know that. Another thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that question and answer. We'll do that at about 11:20 this morning. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly so I can read it. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. And of course, for more information, you can find their full bios on the CWA website. The first one is Morgan Key. Ms. Morgan Key is the founder and CEO of Motive International, a Washington, D.C. based social enterprise focused on multi-sector approaches to conflict mitigation, stability, and sustainability. A former U.S. official, Morgan has served in all 3D U.S. Foreign Affairs Agency. That includes the Department of State, USAID, and the Department of Defense, largely in conflict-affected regions of the world. She served as the Conflict and Stabilization Advisor to the U.S. Africa Command, and led an interagency joint task force in Afghanistan responsible for coalition-wide transition strategy, and has designed and led operations involving U.S. military and civilians, partnerships with business influencers. But not to be just that, she also, prior to her time in the government, Morgan founded and for 10 years ran a non-government organization in Mongolia. Our second person is Benjamin Teitelbaum. Benjamin is an associate professor, and I'll try and pronounce this, ethnomusicology and international affairs. He earned a doctorate from Brown University and a Bachelor of Music degree in nickel harpa performance from Bethany College. That is, and I've heard him play his instrument. It is not your normal instrument to watch him play, but and the music is very interesting. He has previously served as an instructor and head of Nordic Studies, also at the University of Colorado Boulder, and visiting scholar at Karlstad University, Sweden, and Institute for Social Sciences, History, and Philosophy at the University of Campinas, Brazil. Ben's interests include music and politics, reactionary ideology and aesthetics, Western esotericism, political theology, research ethics, and finally, Scandinavian traditional music and folklore. Our third speaker is Alexander Verbeek. He's the founder, Institute for Planetary Security, and is a Dutch environmentalist, public speaker, diplomat, and former strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the past 30 years, he has worked on international security, humanitarian and geopolitical risk issues, and the linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. He served as a lieutenant in the Royal Netherlands Navy and was a diplomat for the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and his last position was strategic policy advisor on global issues in the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And oh, by the way, he did serve in Vienna, Bonn, and London. And our last person on the panel is Sarah Yeager. Okay. Sorry. I try to go alphabetical. Sarah is a human rights expert who leads the engagement of Human Rights Watch with the U.S. government on global human rights issues, with a focus on national security and foreign policy. She served in the Clinton White House, the Obama State Department, and the Trump Defense Department, which is non-political positions. Remember that. Okay. But if you think about it, it's three wide-ranging administrations, okay? She was the first senior advisor on human rights in the chairman's office of the Joint Staff of the Department of Defense, and served as executive director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict, advising warring parties on civilian protection and responsible use of force. So as you can see from our panelists, it's just a tremendously varied body of experience. The interesting thing, if you paid attention to the bios, Sarah and Morgan should have crossed paths. Yesterday was the first day they did that. So without any further ado, what we're going to do is have the opening statements of not more than 5 minutes by each of the panelists, starting with Morgan.
Going on day 3 of a nearly lost voice, but I'm gonna bring it again. I wasn't prepared to go first, but I'm happy to. So I think this is a full room. I can take by that a lot of people are thinking a lot about the upcoming election and are intrigued to know what the rest of the world is maybe thinking. I think, like my panelists, I spend a lot of time abroad and talking to international policy officials and people of all walks of life. And a few things strike me. The first thing I'll just, maybe to validate something people might be wondering is there's a lot of sort of confusion by people around the globe about why the American people have made some of the choices we have in the last few years. They, time and time again, those questions center, I think, more among internationals than when I talk to Americans about this was a choice of the American people, and this reflects something about millions, scores of millions of people's values, as opposed to focusing just on one individual. And so I think that's a really fair and important point to realize, is that people aren't just watching the White House, they're watching all of us, and they're looking at our own values and are sort of confused and frankly disappointed by some of the choices that we've made. And to sort of talk a little bit more bluntly on partisan issues, it's not just Trump. It's a lot of policy decisions we've made. It's also not just the executive branch, it's judicial branch, it's some of the decisions that have been happening on the Supreme Court. But to keep with our panel, the region of the world that I work a lot on currently is Africa, and something pretty big happened in my world just a few weeks ago, and that was the country in Africa where the United States military has basically one of its only permanent installations on the continent, Niger. Niger underwent a coup d'etat not long ago, last summer, and for a long time the US government was sort of debating and deliberating whether or not we should declare it a coup, something I know Sarah works on. It's a very high stakes issue when you declare something a coup. We have laws in our country that say you can no longer engage with that country on certain issues. You can no longer provide development assistance in most regards, but also defense and security cooperation assistance. So this was a pretty big deal. And for a while, we didn't declare it a coup. And then we finally did. And when that happened, we had to basically stop a lot of the activities that we were doing in Niger. And we had to define a pathway back to how Niger could, sort of reset its relations. And the first thing they had to do was have democratic elections. So we sent a very high-profile diplomatic team over to Niger just a few weeks ago to sort of convey that message firmly. We want to see democratic elections, and then we can get back on track. Those conversations did not go well. The Niger government basically said, F off. Get out of here. And that has happened several times across Africa just in the past year. There have been a series of coup d'etats where when the US has engaged, the response has pretty consistently been, F off, who do you think you are? We've lost so much leverage and credibility in talking about democratic ideals and values, but also across the world, and in particular in this one region, in the Sahel, in Africa, there was a very, very calculated recognition that the volatility that we have in our political system and our society in the US created a window of opportunity where regimes around the world could do things that they might otherwise not, be able to sort of get away with. And there was a very calculated risk in knowing that our election, no matter what the outcome in November, there was going to be such sort of internal turmoil in the United States and in our political systems that very little sort of implications and focus would be, or pressure would be put on African juntas, military regimes that would have, if we had sort of cohesion and consistency in our own systems and values, could have really applied effective pressure to make sure those regimes didn't entrench themselves. So one place, very real, very calculated. When that junta decided to execute a coup d'état, they were absolutely one of the things on their sort of list of considerations was the United States political system and the upcoming election.
Good, thank you. Ben, you're next in line.
You're probably wondering about folk music. at this point. No, that's one of my affiliations. I should also add I'm faculty in international affairs. I study and have spent the last decades of my life studying the radical right, and it leads globally. I would add, and it leads me to perhaps look at this question in a different way. I imagine that a lot of our conversation is going to be focusing on the implications of a shift in the global order. Only fools, I've heard before, only fools think that they are actually witness to a meaningful change in their life. But you could call me a fool in that case, because I believe that things are actually changing right now, meaningfully. And we just heard an example of why, and also an example of a manifestation of that. But if there was purely a U.S. global hegemonic order reigning in the last decades, it seems to be fraying, and I don't think it's going to be rebuilt. And to the point that that Morgan just made, I actually don't think that the outcome of this upcoming election is going to change that. The die has already been cast. It's been cast by our political disputes, by our inability to act as a nation coherently and cohesively. And so what are the implications of that? I mentioned that I'm a scholar of the radical right. When we talk about all the fretting and all the fear around the world, especially in Europe, looking at our position relative to NATO, relative to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we can, of course, comment on the anxiety that is being felt by those actors abroad and our former allies. David Cameron came over notably to lobby Donald Trump in an expression of that anxiety. But know as well that those allies, the rest of the world, is changing also, and that the impressions of the U.S. Falling off in some way, abdicating its role, are felt by many, but not all, of let's say, Europe in particular. And so I wonder about counter-histories, counter-analyses, counter-understandings of the future and where we're headed, getting lost in some of these conversations. So let that be my opening statement. Be mindful of the fact that there are multiple moving targets in this discussion.
Good, thank you. Sarah?
Hi, I am also losing my voice. Morgan and I are basically morphing into one person, having just met yesterday. Excuse me, it's like a sinus thing. It's not contagious, please come talk to me. I want to say a couple of things because I'm coming from the Washington swamp, where I work on foreign policy, also traveling to other places as an American working on US foreign policy. So I agree with everything that has been said, but wanted to give you a couple observations of my own. One is that during the Trump years, and maybe some of you felt this way too when you were traveling internationally, I actually found kindred spirits among all the other people in the world, much more than with Americans, at least when I was traveling around America. I think in a group like this, we would all be fairly kindred spirits. But in other places, I really felt much closer to Africans, Asians, people in Europe, all very concerned as I was about what was happening to America. So for all of the terribleness, it also brought, I think, for those of us who did not want Trump to be president and saw the terrible things that were happening, it actually brought us closer to the rest of the world. From Washington, there are things that policymakers are doing to prepare for the election. There are things that people like me who are advocates with policymakers are doing to prepare. And then there are things that leaders in other countries are doing to prepare. Policymakers are trying, in the Biden administration, are trying to get things done because they know that they might be out. Some of these things are not good, at least as far as I'm concerned. So some of them, great, trying to make them permanent, LGBT rights, LGBTQI+ rights, women's rights, these kinds of things, trying to cement them, trying to make them permanent. Other things like the Saudi Defense Pact, which you've probably heard about, trying to make that permanent. and get it actually signed, sealed, and delivered. I don't like that, but that's something that they're trying to get done very quickly because they only have possibly a year left. Now, from my standpoint, the things that my community, in the human rights community, are doing, trying, again, to make those good things permanent, but also trying to insulate things that we know President Trump will target, like the LGBTQ rights in the State Department, the things that they work on, the women's rights, the reproductive efforts that the State Department has, the civilian protection progress that the US military has made. We're trying to figure out ways to keep these quiet because we don't want them to raise alarm bells with the Trumpers, the Republicans who come in, who then try to get them nixed. And this is a very delicate balance because we also want funding for those programs. We also want attention to the good things that they're doing. So we're trying to keep them quiet while also making sure that they remain. And then I would say the leaders overseas, you can see them posturing and trying to game the system. So there are two extremes to this. One is Zelensky. You saw this the other day where he's been asking for more weapons, of course, from the United States. When Trump said, I have solutions for Ukraine and Russia, Zelensky said, I would, warmly welcome a conversation with Trump. That is diplomatic speak, but it is also a message to Joe Biden to say, you better send those weapons, right? So there are leaders playing the system. Viktor Orban, who is basically an authoritarian who runs Hungary in Europe, has been doing conferences with Ted Cruz in Texas. He came to the United States a couple weeks ago, and instead of doing a state visit to the White House, he went directly to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump. So these are the kinds of gaming of the system that people are doing. The final thing I'll say is that my work, which is trying to get the United States to do good things on human rights, or trying to get the United States to stop doing bad things on human rights, gets extremely frustrating as of this moment. Because first we had Ukraine that took up everyone's bandwidth. So all of the other human rights abuses in the world, we had to try to call attention to, and it was very difficult. Then Gaza came. That took up everyone's bandwidth and time and attention. Now there's an election, and we are not going to be able to get the kind of progress and attention to all of and believe me, there are so many human rights abuses that are happening in the world that the United States could be doing something good about. So my position becomes extraordinarily frustrating, and we'll just keep at it. But that attention is going to be elsewhere.
Great, Alexander.
Thank you. It's not working. Could you put it on the mic?
Not mine.
I'll use this one. This one's working. Okay, thanks. We have 440 million people in Europe. I'm just one of them, so I'm not speaking for Europe, I'm not speaking for my government that I left 10 years ago. So I'm just one voice. But I think many in Europe, I should have put it on. There's an on and off button on the side. No, nobody tells me anything here. I think the word public speaker was mentioned in the introduction. I didn't know this. So I'll speak for myself, for my perspective here, but I think many people in Europe are really worried about what is happening in the United States. Yes, Ben, I fully agree with what you just said on it's a slow. Is it still working? Yep. So there's a gradual movement of the U.S. Kind of moving out of its central role. The 20th century was the century of the U.S. since in 1917 the U.S. stepped in, and now after about a century it's becoming a more multipolar world. So that's a gradual movement. But history often goes very slowly, and then sometimes it develops really, really quickly. And it's possible that if Trump is re-elected, history will move really, really quickly, and it could have devastating consequences. In Europe, we have, for the first time, we have war again on our ground, apart from the Balkans war in the 1990s, that was kind of more localized, although it was mainly the refugee crisis that made it a more international crisis. But Ukraine is much more pivotal in the history. Later we will look back at the war in Ukraine as something that you could either compare to Poland in 1939, or it might become a more regional thing and just a very sad development. But we don't know yet what place it will take in the world history. If Trump takes over, being so much in the hands of Putin by all kinds of ways, he claims he will stop the war in 24 hours. And that schedule seems to be that he will arm twist Zelensky into giving away the territory that's already occupied by Russia. And if that is the game plan, rewarding aggression, we're very much back into the late 1930s. In getting back the Rhineland and occupying Sudetenland in the Anschluss of Austria, in occupying the Czech Republic, in brutally invading Poland. We've seen Georgia in what is it, 7th of August, in 2007, 2008, in that summer. We've then seen the occupation of the Crimea in 2014. We now see the attempt to occupy all of Ukraine, which miserably failed, but it's still a brutal war. We see this piecemeal taking of more and more land. The nature of these kind of regimes, and we've seen many of these in the past, is not that at a certain moment their hunger is stilled once they have taken a piece of land. The Russian economy is now fully weaponizing itself. It's becoming a war economy, and it's unlikely that that will suddenly just turn around. So there is much more a feeling of more imminent danger. There's only in the past few months, there's for the first time in the media, you see that there's talk about war in Europe. We've never been in that place. And then we go back to the theme of today, of the elections. We have one option of President Biden, who has shown to be a reliable, wise leader with a long-term vision, and who's really to try to deliver the best for the American people and recognizing the international role. And the alternative is a man who has been president, who made an absolute mess out of everything, who cannot be trusted on promises. But if he comes back this time, unlike last time, this time he will be prepared. There's a lot of people that know exactly what they want to do this time, and they didn't have that last time. And all the information that's coming out, and most of it's just on its Project 2025, it's all on the internet. You can read about what the plans are not good for peace and stability in the world, nor are they good for America. So what is the view in Europe? This is just one view, it's just my view. But what is the view in Europe generally? I think we are very, very worried about it. We don't understand the appeal of voting for the alternative to Biden. We understand that you can talk about age of a president, etc., but we don't have much other criticism. But we deeply fear a second Trump government. So yeah, that's a kind of opening statement. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That's all very interesting. But I didn't hear you talk about the worldview of our dysfunctional Congress. or are they just being ignored? So let's start with Sarah on that.
Do you mean how the Congress feels about the next election?
Well, twofold. One, how the world views Congress and its, I don't want to be political, but there's failure to perform. Mm-hmm. And then how do they view the world view? Are we turning isolationist more than we realize? Or are there some who still are looking outward?
Right. Okay. So, show me a country where the parliamentary system or the congressional system is not dysfunctional. That's not to say that ours isn't in the extreme. Ours is extraordinarily dysfunctional at the moment. But I'm not, so I think there are things called CODELs, congressional delegations, that go out all the time to various countries, to conflicts, literally every day there is a congressional delegation going somewhere. So countries and leaders and people of the world see Congress, but they see individual members, so they have those relationships. I'm not sure that the rest of the world, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, look at Congress as as a monolith, as an entity that has much to do with the next election necessarily. I think the thing that has struck me the most about Congress, at least from a human rights standpoint, is that so the polarization is huge. There is definitely that MAGA isolationist bent. There are the other side, which still wants to engage in the world, but which is so taken up by trying to fight this isolationist bent that they're not actually engaging in the world. And so the things that I care about, where we used to have champions on both sides of the aisle for human rights around the world, for people who were experiencing mass atrocities, armed conflict, repression, support for human rights defenders, money going to them, even just speaking out for them, which does so much for them in their home countries. We're not seeing a lot of that anymore. There are senators and representatives who have their sort of pet projects because maybe they were in Sudan or maybe they went to Vietnam. But otherwise, they are not champions for the things that I think a lot of us in this room would consider American values of democracy, human rights, freedoms, and helping people around the world realize those things because of our position of power.
Thank you. Alexander? From your European perspective.
On this last issue of human rights, we need America on board on human rights. It is something where Europe and the US have been cooperating on for more than half a century very effectively. And that is something more general. I think in a world where other powers are rapidly rising, including China, it is important that we guys stick together. And we did so in the past, and I hope we will continue. I wouldn't be here without America, without the Americans willing to help us again in the Second World War to solve our problems in Europe. In the Second World War, when finally the US stepped in, it took a bit of time. It was only in December 41, but once you stepped in, it was already in the next year, everything changed. In 42, everything changed. My father was liberated from German imprisonment. My mother was liberated after 3.5 years of being in a Japanese camp. If the US had not stepped in and not beaten those enemies, I wouldn't be here. So I grew up in the Netherlands. I was born in 65. America was our ideal. They liberated us. They stood for liberty, individual as well as between countries. In the household where I grew up, not any negative word about the US was allowed to be said. There was a lot of gratefulness America was also growing up in the 70s and early 80s. America was our ideal. The Hollywood movies came from there. America had the best products. Americans all had whatever, their washing machines or refrigerators, and television was actually in color, and it was the whole day instead of just a few hours in black and white, as the way I grew up. We had one channel called Netherlands 1 because we had the ambition to make Netherlands 2 someday. And nowadays, when we grow up, if I look at my daughter, she's 21, the way that she views America, the way that she is looking at what is happening now, it is much more oriented at the hope of a much more unified Europe that is getting its things in order in the way we govern and the way that we take care of our own people and the international outlook that we have. We fear that we're losing that tie with the US. And both for the US as well as for Europe, it is good to stick together because there's a lot of bullies in the small neighborhood that we are living on that is called the planet Earth. And those bullies are getting stronger. So we need to stick together, and for that you need a government in America that has an international outlook and a functioning Congress. Not a Congress like yesterday that wasn't able to just hammer through something that should have been so easy, that you allow your secret services to monitor dangerous foreign interference, which is the way to prevent terrorism. How is it possible that your Congress is not able to agree on such a thing which is good for each and every American? Even such a simple thing is nowadays difficult. And yes, that worries us if we see those kind of things coming from Europe in an increasing dangerous world. So let's stick together. It's why I'm here, because I try, my individual independent level to keep ties between Europe and America functioning, and and including on the human rights. Let's stick together there too. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
Can I jump in? Because your question, Barry, was about global views of Congress. And there's a shorthand going around in parts of Europe, and it is Moscow Marjorie. There is attention abroad to the fact that a small number of actors in the House of Representatives are able to delay an aid package which is seen as a life or death matter for one of the largest countries in Europe. And this is, the outrage over this relates to the fact, and also I think just the utter helplessness that some are feeling relates to the fact that they know a majority of the American people, even if the margins have gone down, a majority of the American people support and want to see support for Ukraine. A majority of the US Senate supports and wants to support Ukraine. A majority of the US House of Representatives wants to support Ukraine. A similar situation was playing out in the EU, of course, where an overwhelming majority of the states wanted to support Ukraine, but one, Hungary, was getting in the way, with Slovakia also being a player in that. The EU was able to overcome that. The US Senate was able to overcome it, but here we are. What are we at, 5 months, 6 months after this conversation had started, and a small minority of players in the US House have held this up. And it is quite optimistic to think that what is at stake is the flag that flies over the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. It's often good, I think, if someone tells you what they want to do, that you listen to them. And what Putin said in his interview with Tucker Carlson was that he has a religious pseudo-religious historical right of dominion over Ukraine and Ukrainians, regardless of what they think about it. That's what the long history lesson was that he gave to Tucker in that interview. And we've also seen in the proposals for a peace plan that came up to that point that it was not just about the Donbass. It wasn't just about Kherson or Zaporizhia. It also included disarmament of the country. It also included cultural colonial practices of renaming streets, and very much in line with the practices of the Russian occupiers when they have been in Mariupol and these other places who burn Ukrainian literature. They want to take over that country, and they want to disarm it. Why? Because they're worried that Ukraine is going to lay siege to this nuclear superpower. No, they want it disarmed because if they can't take it this time, if the full-scale invasion of the country didn't work out because they didn't plan it and didn't anticipate the resistance, they want to be able to do it again next time, and they would like it to go better, and they would like us to play along with it. So that's what's at stake for people right now, I think, surrounding this conflict, not just in Ukraine, but in all the other countries who have a recent history of invasion and know that they could be next, and they see a handful of targets. Marjorie Taylor Greene, yes. Mike Johnson also, who every morning I get up and I look at my phone to see, did something happen? Is he saying something? Is Marjorie Taylor Greene upset at him, which would be a great sign? And it has just gone day after day, week after week, month after month, and that is being targets being understood correctly, I think, by populations abroad as being a problem of Congress.
Thank you. Morgan, would you like to add to that?
I mean, I'm sure there's more questions I'd love to get through, but something that has been definitely on world headlines is the corruption charges against Senator Menendez, and the transactional nature of how foreign governments can influence the purse strings of the United States government, which is Congress, right? You can pump money into members of Congress's businesses through their spouses. You can, wine and dine them, and therefore you can get foreign policy to swing your way. Other examples of that I think we could see more of as we lead up to the election. You can see foreign governments. This is such an obvious and, frankly, if a good bet. If you are a foreign government, why wouldn't you buy large shares in Truth Social and in any of Trump holding businesses right now? Of course, that's a good business bet from a political standpoint. So this transactional nature that you see in the executive branch and in the legislative branch is becoming very overt, very flagrant, and it's almost just baked into how foreign governments now feel they need to interact with the United States government.
Great, thank you. I have a question from a student. With the current format with the 2024 elections, why would another country want to move towards democracy, highlighting the election cycles when we're disenfranchising voters of third-party candidates? For example, censoring RFK Jr. Who would like to take that one? Go ahead, Alex.
Well, it suggests a bit that the US is the example for the world of democracy, and I beg to disagree here. I think there are many forms in which a democracy can function. If you compare the Anglo-Saxon system with the way that we do it on continental Europe, it's very different. We have in the Netherlands, I think you can choose between 20 or 30 parties. Many of them I don't even know their name. In our parliament of 150 seats, we have, I think, about 13 or 15 parties. But the crucial thing is that since, I think, the 1880s, not one single party had more than 50% of the vote. So we always need a coalition government. Well, the downside of it, that any decision is watered down because it's a compromise. But the advantage of it is that you avoid getting some kind of extremist who's heading the Netherlands, because you tend to go more towards the middle. And the other advantage is that people have more trust in democracy because their voice is much better represented. In our country, it's one man, one vote, and that's another thing. There's not this layered system. The two are connected actually to each other. Because if you have a layered system, by first you vote in a state, and then you have this kind of electoral college thing, which is kind of unique in the world, and then you out of that get finally your president elected. There's many states in the US where it's no use to go. Let's say if you live in California, why would you vote? Because the Democrats win anyway. So a lot of votes are not really counted in a way. And in our country, all of them are counted. So people losing their faith in democracy, I think Churchill once said it's a pretty bad system, but I can't think of any better one. And I think that still holds true. If you look at the countries in the world that are that are doing well, and I think the best way to measure if countries are doing well is not the GDP, but is the happiness measurements. There are different ways to do it, but there's this World Happiness Index. There's a lot you can say against it, but as a rough indication, you see the top 10 countries in there are, I'm pretty sure, I do have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that is all of them are democracies. You find very much Scandinavian countries in there. We are there as Netherlands. We're number 5 last time I checked. So democracy does deliver to the people. So if you see things happening in the US that are not going the way you would like to see it, it's not the fault of democracy per se, but it's a temporary problem that you're dealing with, which is serious, but it's not the fault of democracy. Can you improve your democracy? Well, it's difficult to change the constitution, but throughout the years, for 250 years or so, you've been running this country pretty well with the system that you have. And yeah, now you have a temporary hiccup. Solve it, and you're back in a good system.
That was very hopeful, but Sarah, what would you say? Do you agree with him or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say on this topic because I agree that the United States is not necessarily the model here. It's other countries, and so in my work, I see people agitating all the time for democracy because it is the system that allows the fullest expression of human rights. And so when I see people agitating for democracy, it's not because of the United States. It is because they want freedoms and they want their human rights and they want to have a say in their government. And I think if there's any silver lining to what has happened to the United States, it's that we can start looking to other countries to take on that leadership mantle of what democracy looks like, and maybe get a more democratic view of democracy in the world.
Morgan, anything to add to that, or Ben, either way?
No, I mean, in political science, I mean, the definition of democracy is just a government accountable to the people. There's a million forms of it. So this idea that, democracy equals a bicameral legislator, 3-branch of government U.S. system is a fallacy. When you bring it down to that simple definition, who doesn't want a government that's accountable to its people? Something that the question stemmed though from like a multi-party, instead of a 2-party dominated system, independent or 3rd or 4th or 5th political parties. Also in political science, there are so many theories and evidence to support that actually the more competition you have, as Alexander was saying, the more moderated the outcome is, because all of the different factions and parties are forced to compromise, and so you're forced to come up with a more inclusive social contract. I mean, this comes out of, this goes back to Enlightenment theory and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and social contracts. So it's sad to me that our political system, our democracy in the US, has basically made it impossible for a third party to exist without doing more harm than good. And so you do have a sort of winner-take-all 2-party system where it's like, oh, RFK, oh, Nader, we get angry, even though part of me is like, actually from a pure democratic ideal standpoint, those are playing a critical function in a democracy to help moderate the others, because naturally when those candidates opt into an election, most of the time, unless they're delusional, they don't think they're going to win, but they're playing a role of moderation, and they know that whatever camp of people they have amassed and gained the support of, when they step out of the race, the other remaining candidates have to adapt and widen their social contract to enfranchise those voters. So that's a really critical role in a democracy. And so I would like to see, as Sarah said, us, Americans take a look at other systems of democracy around the world that have made this many-party system actually incredibly effective and play a really, really important theoretical and practical role in people exercising their voice and rights.
Okay, well that's nice, but other than our election of Trump versus Biden, what other current policies are making countries not turn to democracy, but turn to China, Russia, et cetera, for development? You know, is that a contrarian position that they support democracy, yet they're going to a non-democratic country for support? Ben, you're up.
Well, I think a case study for that would be Brazil. And there are layers of complexity there, but this is a country that was recently run by Jair Bolsonaro, a right-wing populist government, very much in the same caste as Trump, Orban, and others. Now being run by President Lula. Much of that election had to do with the fate of democracy in Brazil. That's how Lula campaigned. You know, you can vote for me, yes, but vote for me for the ability to vote in the future. Was a shorthand phrase you would hear on the streets at the time, and yet it's become quite clear since the election of Lula where his sympathies lie. He seems to miss no opportunity to offer apologetics, defenses of Maduro to the north, of China, of Putin. As well, and a lot of this is not, you could say it's ideological, but there's also an economic aspect to this, that they need fertilizer, they need infrastructure, and Russia and China have been the ones to offer that. So you end up with a picture of a world order. It's not new, actually, I shouldn't say that by any means, but it's a world order where democracy can be embraced by some players, not others, but partnerships with totalitarian governments can blossom.
Alexander?
Well, the thing that triggered me, mainly what you said, is that I realized that it's an aspect we didn't speak about, but if Trump will be re-elected as president, will there be new elections in 2028 or not? Will democracy survive another term of Donald Trump? And that is, if I spoke earlier about fear that we have in Europe about the future, I mentioned the more immediate one of Russia and Ukraine and war, etc. Another one is that we might lose our traditional democratic partner on the other side of the ocean, the very same democratic partner that assured that we got our democracies back when they were stolen from us by a strange-looking fascist, and now we look at this side of the ocean. So that's, yeah, it's maybe not answering the question directly, but it's, I think, an element that we need in this debate as well, because democracy seems to be on the ballot here. Thanks.
Thank you. This is from a student, and they're asking for each one of you to say, in relation to the upcoming election, what would your ideal American involvement with the world look like? Let's start with Morgan.
So I work a lot with the State Department. I used to be a diplomat in the State Department, and now they're one of my clients for my business, and we implement foreign policy programs around the world on their behalf. And something has, a trend that I've seen more of recently that disturbs me is prior to our own elections, and increasingly prior to elections in whatever host country we're in, we will just recoil and contract. It's this, like, you know, we all sort of see it in the ends of a political term, where, as Sarah mentioned, you try to hurry up and get some things done, but then there's always this period of time when no one's even motivated anymore to govern and to do anything, because the chances are good that it's all going to be over. So everyone just sort of waits and sees. But I think that is what's disturbing, is we have ceded being part of conversations about democratic processes with other countries when they're having elections, because I think we are increasingly scared that we'd be pointed to as hypocrites, that who are we to sort of talk about free and fair elections or multi-party, systems when we don't have one that functions. And so instead of putting ourselves out there and having awkward conversations, I'm increasingly getting instructions from the State Department to basically just recoil, just go into a cave for 6 months or 9 months before this country is having an election, or 6 or 9 months before a US election. It's like, well, between our election cycles and every other country in the world's election cycles, now we're just in pure recoil, disengagement mode. And I find that really disturbing.
Ben?
I think that we need to be honest with ourselves about the transitions of the global order. If we once existed in a unipolar world, we are absolutely moving to one of multipolarity. That's been the key phrase. What do we do about that? One thing I think I wouldn't want to say withdrawal, because that means just non-participation, but if China invades Taiwan, can we stop that? I'm not sure that we can. And it might not be fruitful for us to go around pretending that we actually have the ability to do that much about it. I would hope for, having said that, I don't look to the rise of a multipolar world in the way, for example, that Brazil did. They described it as benign multipolarity. I don't put a lot of value in these structures of world governments necessarily. They can do bad things and they can do good things, and I hope that good people fight against the bad things. But if we have a bit more of a sober look at what our abilities are, we stake out our priorities. Having done that, I hope that we fight for them. I hope if that is diplomacy, then I hope we do it, and I hope we do it vigorously. If it goes beyond diplomacy, I hope there too that the inertia of our political process doesn't take our knees out.
First of all, I have to stop doing so many depressing panels first thing in the morning. Like, they keep loading me up with, and Morgan too, Apocalypse Now yesterday. This is so depressing. I have so many things that I would want for America in the world after this next election, but I would say the one thing for me is that I think that a lot of administrations recently, Republican and Democrat, have lost sight of the long game, American values, and what is in America's interest, which is tied to American values. It is not to say that America has always been a good actor in the world. We all know that it has not. But recently, at least from what I've seen in my lifetime, there is a lot of exchange of those long-term interests and values for short-term gains. So we're so concerned about Russia, we're so concerned about China, we're going to send weapons upon weapons upon weapons to everyone to say, please be our friend and don't be their friend, right? So it's that kind of thing that I think, and that's, I mean, don't be fooled by when President Trump says, America first, we're gonna focus at home. No, he's gonna engage just as much with the world, but it's going to be in a much more cynical way. It's about the how. It's about the how we engage. And even this administration, I have been very critical of these short-term gains, the Saudi Defense Pact, the $4 billion in drones that is going to India at a time when India is turning authoritarian. These are because of China. It is because of China. And I think that if we look at what is in the best interest of Americans, it is to engage in the world in a different way that might not look satisfying in the moment. But you've all heard about, let's fund the State Department instead of so much the Department of Defense. Fund the diplomats and the development and the foreign assistance and all of the things that people look to America for. And that's not to say that we're not going to continue selling weapons. I am sure we are. But this kind of very cynical approach to these short-term gains, I think, is something that I would definitely want to see changed.
Alexander?
In the 20th century, the world was, in a way, more easy to understand that the countries that were democratic, like the US, like Europe, also had the most economic success. So you were rewarded by being a democracy and taking care of your own people and having certain, moral and legal values on how you treat people. That was rewarded by a thriving economy. And now it's a new system. You see that what happened in Southeast Asia, first with the Asian tigers in the 1980s, and later now on a large scale in China, that has been extremely successful economically, lifting 400 million people out of poverty that are now living in apartments and can watch television, which is an enormous success, and there's all kinds of other ways to measure their economic success, but under a truly repressive, non-democratic system, which is very much against all the kind of values that we share in the West. And that creates a completely new situation. And in that field, I think it's important that we stick to the values that we have believed in the past. Just as Sarah seconds ago was referring to as well, it's important to keep that long-term eye on the ball of where you want to go to. That doesn't mean isolation. Sorry, I'm insulating my house now. I'm mixing up my English. Isolation. America has tried isolation in the 1930s at a moment that in the rest of the world oppressive regimes were taking over and were growing in part in their power, and that didn't work until this massive wake-up call in December 41 in Pearl Harbor, and suddenly it was just like we have to get involved. And then, since it was at such a late stage, it was a very brutal, long time, costly involvement. It cost you like 400,000 Americans that lost their lives in the war. I'm not saying that you could have avoided it if a few years earlier, but an earlier international involvement, maybe it could have changed how the world would further develop. It's not an in vitro kind of test that you can do again. It's an interesting thought. Now we're there's a lot of parallels to let's say the middle of the 20th century that we find ourselves in. Again, you see other systems coming up that are very alien to our values, and that ultimately might threaten the way that we live our lives in the West. So let's stick together. Let's stick to our values, and live up to the promise that we have had for already so many years.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes left. I'm going to try and slam in 2 more questions and closing statements. But the next one is for Sarah, actually. To what extent are human rights a part of U.S. appeal to foreign governments? And to what extent are they a liability to those governments because they would rather not be bothered, such as by China, which won't bother countries about their domestic affairs?
I mean, this is my whole career. I'll try to do this in just a couple of minutes. The United States, I think much to its credit, when it is selling weapons and offering security assistance and doing training and advising, this is a lot of what we do with the rest of the world, especially after 9/11. It's all like this counterterrorism frame. We include human rights conditions in that. We include civilian protection conditions. We include training on international law and these kinds of things. What I continue to hear, I mean, you guys make up your own minds. What I continue to hear is that if we didn't have those things, then other countries who are going to China would be much more willing to come to the United States. That has not, because it's so much easier. China doesn't care about human rights. That has not been my experience. My experience with other militaries around the world in particular is that they actually appreciate having that kind of relationship with the United States where they can say, yeah, we did a human rights training. We're involved in the rules-based order through international law. There are these very important connections to America through that. So sure, there are some states that don't want that, don't want us messing about in their human rights business. But they were probably going to go to Russia or China anyway. So there is something that is happening, though, where because we are so worried about China in particular, that we, the United States, as a collective, are overlooking the human rights abuses in many places around the world, particularly in Asia. So we will have a trade negotiation. We will have, X or Y agreement that will not condemn what we are seeing as human rights abuses in that country because we think that it's going to make it too high of a hurdle for that country and they're just going to go to China instead. I just don't think that that's true.
Good, thank you. One last quick one. This is for Alexander because he's a climate change guy. Could the rising instability in the world be intricately linked to the Earth heating and entropy rising naturally?
Yes, clearly. Climate change is the biggest long-term threat that is rapidly increasing its impact. And that impact includes a lot of people not being able to live anymore on the land where they used to live. They're moving somewhere else. They're going to find the resources that they need or a climate where they can lead. And that leads to a lot of tensions. You see it now on small scale. I'm not sure whether it was this session or an earlier session today where it was referred to as an example, as in the Sahel, this area just south of the Sahara in Africa where it's getting drier, where people are coming on the move, and they, let's say the nomadic herdsmen, they clash with people that are sedentary farmers. Those kind of impacts will grow. It will become more international. Countries will look over the border in other countries if they don't have enough water anymore. Think, for instance, about Ethiopia building a dam in the Nile, which then leads to less water in Egypt. But Egypt, with a rapidly growing population in a country with much higher temperatures and more drought problems than in the past, needs that water. So you got threats like we're going to bomb the Gerd Dam so that the water still comes out. And those kind of potential international conflicts, there's hundreds of varieties in it. So tackling climate change is an essential element in creating a better and more stable world. And we frankly, we can't live on this planet anymore if we don't tackle this problem. Now, the problem with climate change is that you need international consensus to go there. It doesn't help if just one country is doing it. And that in a time when there are rising tensions between countries, the kind of things that we discussed today. So we all keep each other hostage this way. So you need international cooperation to solve the thing that threatens all of us, climate change. And it's a horrible, difficult, intricate problem. I hope our politicians will solve this for us.
Thank you. Morgan, could you start with your closing statement in about 30 seconds?
Sure, yeah, I can. I'm going to repeat what I said in one of my closing statements yesterday, which is civil discourse. Do it. Please do it. Don't shy away from awkward political conversations, especially in the lead up to November with people you know. They're probably not in Boulder, but maybe they're somewhere else, your friends and family away. And when you do engage on those issues, remember that you have one vote, but you can influence many by having conversations. Don't just talk about the interests or positions or how someone's going to vote. I challenge you all to ask good questions, to probe, to get to the values. Really hold your friends and family accountable for what are your values, how will you vote accordingly. That's how this election will be shaped in a way that you'll feel good about, and hopefully so will I.
Great, thank you. Ben?
One way to read the history of the 20th century is to look at the apparent surface-level conflicts between capitalism and communism as they spread throughout the world and say actually what was going on in all those cases was a common desire for, especially the non-Western world, to modernize, and it used the cover of those other ideologies and state systems in order to do that thing, to modernize. I'm thinking about that as I'm processing a statement that Sarah made, actually, that with the spread of democracy, and this was in response to the student question, with the spread of democracy, it might not always be embraced as democracy per se. But what is being desired in many cases is something that is attendant to democracy, something that I think would be more apparent in the compound concept of liberal democracy, namely freedom. I think that interest is still vibrant. I think that is still vigorous right now. And to use Brazil as one example again, despite all of the international shifts and alliances that we see coming out of Brasilia, there is still broad sympathy among the population for the United States. I don't think it's for democracy per se. I think it is for freedom. And I think that narrative can continue to live and thrive and change things.
Thank you. Sarah, please.
2 quick things. 1, let's all commit to go vote. And 2, as you engage in this election year, not only in the presidential election, but state and local, please ask questions about foreign policy. It needs to be on the ballot.
Great. Alex?
I agree with all 3 previous speakers. Thanks for coming here, and yeah, do vote.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the round for the